Or good afternoon, as the case may be, and welcome to Distribution Strategy Group's Technology Leader Panel. Today's topic is From Data to Insights, Analytics Strategies for Distributors. I'm Jonathan Bine. I'll be your host today. I hope wherever you are warm, especially to our fellow citizens in the southern part of the United States who are experiencing more snow perhaps than they've ever seen in their life. We're going to be featuring Greg Hartunian from Epicor and Justin Johnson from Motivate. I'm going to say just a couple words first on this, and then we will welcome them in just a moment. The state of analytics has changed radically over the last number of years. We've heard about things like big data. We've heard about things like AI, data lakes, data warehouses, et cetera. We're really getting to a point where there's a lot of new metrics, new types of data analytics that can help drive better decision making. So that's what we're going to be exploring with Greg and Justin today. You are invited and welcome to ask questions. There's a little button for asking questions at the bottom. My only request is if you do ask, make sure you're not posing it as anonymous. We will likely not respond to an anonymously posed question. I want to let you know about the Applied AI for Distributors 2025 in Chicago, June 24th to the 26th. And it's a really, really strong conference. We've run it twice. It gets better each time. We'll be looking at different AI applications. We're going to be hearing from AI thought leaders on where you can use AI to drive sales, revenue growth, future of AI. And also, the first 75 registrants will gain access to a pre-conference session titled Distribution 2030, AI-Driven Transformation. Some of the folks who we've already signed up as speakers include Trent Gillespie, CEO of Stellus AI, Don Sarno, SVP of Digital Enterprise North America at Sonopar, and Noel Russell, founder and chief AI officer at AI Leadership. Go to appliedaifordistributors.com or scan the QR code. And next, I would like to welcome Justin and Greg.
Thanks so much,
We're here.
Jonathan.
Thanks, Jonathan.
How are you guys doing?
Fantastic. Great to be here.
Staying warm. We've got a pretty cold here up in the greater Boston area, but we're used to it. So good luck to the rest of the country getting a little of this cold dose.
I hear it's got to be so rough on them. I mean, it must be way out of their comfort zone. As I alluded at the beginning of the call, we've seen a lot of shift in what's available analytically. When you guys think about what we've seen as a shift in terms of big data, analytics, AI, what have you seen over the last few years? What have you noticed?
Big thing I've noticed is there's this huge push to leverage big data, right? And so I think a lot of businesses are wondering, like, how do I go about doing that? And then they're wondering, well, what does really big data mean? Right. And, as you pointed out, in one of our earlier conversations, it means processing tens of millions of rows and transactions. And I think what I'm encouraged about is less a growing need to analyze big data, right? But more the fact that this exposure to what you can do with big data is getting companies focused on practical applications of AI, statistical methods to analyze the structured data that they have. So I always like to delineate between, well, what is really big data and then what is truly structured data. And the whole idea around big data is analyzing and identifying observations and inferences that you can use to exploit from really unstructured data of tens of millions of lines, right? And identifying these relationships. And most distributors don't need to deal with that. You've mentioned that a few times. They don't have big data. They really have well-structured data. So what I've observed over the last several years is really a lot more attention on doing more with the data that you have. And distributors have a lot of data. It may not be big data, but that's okay. It's tucked in data to your ERP, and as we kind of discuss more, we'll talk about how you can exploit that.
That example, sorry, Justin, in that example, a smaller distributor might have 25,000 SKUs and 1,000 customers. And if you look at 1,000 times 25,000, you're looking at a number like 25 million. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about where you're?
Yeah, exactly. And it's even less than that in terms of being a pragmatic subset of that. Like, because those 25,000 items, there may only be like 2,000 or 3,000 that are active that they've sold in the last 18 months or 24 months. So, and out of those 1,000 customers, 800 of those customers may be mom and pop customers that you would never need to analyze as an individual customer. You'd want to lump them all together, right? So when we actually break it down into like the data points they truly need to analyze, we're talking several thousand. And one of the things I've observed is that companies aren't doing a particularly good job of practically addressing that data, let alone this big data problem. It's how do we address the small subset of data points that we have that we really need to do a better job on. And I think that's where I'd like to see people's attention start to really get focused on.
Yeah, that's a great point, both of you. I think if we just look at sales order data as a good example, right? Distributors are sales organizations. Sure, there's inventory planning, there's a lot of other aspects to it, but to grow and to better serve customers, they have to understand what they've sold and who they've sold it to. And the ERP systems from the last forever ago have pretty good data sets there, right? They've got SKUs, they've got part numbers, they've got the customer. And then it's sort of, we talk about big data. Well, it's much simpler than that, right? If you want to better serve a customer or grow your business, you isolate who bought what when, and then you start to run some patterns and trends around that data so you can start to make sense of anticipating needs, showing up before the customer even calls, making sure you're not cold calling and selling them a product they don't need. All sorts of different things you can do when you analyze that data, but that data's there. It may not be perfect, but it's perfect for what that data set is, and you can extract a lot of things. Sure, other larger distributors, for example, may have a lot more data points around it, but the core of who bought what when, who is this customer, and to Greg's point, like, let's not over focus on somebody that bought one product 10 years ago, right? That belongs here. It's the repeat customers and where they're at and who they are, and then potentially finding other customers that look like those to go and sell to.
Yeah, that's a trickier one, right? Like finding other customers to then go sell into is but you can all there's tech like clustering, like we've talked about, like
Absolutely.
There's machine learning clustering algorithms that will look for common items that have a common set of characteristics in their demand. And if you can identify those, you can also apply those same types of logics to the types of customers that may make a better fit for your product. So if you're selling to customers, customer A may not be buying that product, but they could be a good candidate for that. So those can be recommendations that are referenced to a salesperson to recommend those customers.
Right. And on that point,
buy those products, right?
Exactly. We always recommend to our customers that they start to cluster the customers. I mean, they know their peer groups, right? It's a small wastewater plant in Detroit versus, New York City or whatever that is. They're not just the names of these companies. They have characteristics that make them who they are: size of the company, their region, their industry, their market, their SIC. There's all sorts of things that you can quickly and easily do to group these peers and then go to the next level.
Yeah, and what's interesting too, I think, because like the big, it's not a myth. AI can do a lot of great things, but I think the simplest thing that we can do is let it identify things that we would individually do as an analyst looking down, and like you said, If there's customers that have a common set of characteristics, what are those characteristics? Use the technology to then hunt across my entire database, okay, to identify other customers that have those same characteristics. So I'm not having to go in and manually figure that out or call 24 salespeople, right? Like that's a practical application of artificial intelligence. And it's arguably not even AI. It's just an automated way of recognizing common attributes, but it's using tech.
Greg, you'd mentioned demand patterns, and one of the things that ERP systems have historically done is provide some functionality around demand planning. In this new day and age, how do ERP systems, or how does the Epicor ERP system use something more like predictive analytics or AI to forecast future inventory needs?
Sure. I think historically, I'd argue that most ERP systems didn't really do a good job. Like if you ask, if you randomly call an ERP vendor and say like, well, talk to me about your demand planning, what they're really going to be describing is the execution layer. So based on what my customers are ordering, how do I net that out against my available supply to meet that demand and ship them what I want? And that's really an execution conversation. It's not a prediction of what my customers will buy. And historically, ERP systems have done a very inadequate job on the predictive planning. They've done what I would say is a pretty effective job of execution. In other words, given an available on-hand inventory, right, that's stored, given the incoming supply that I've ordered from my suppliers, given demand that my customers have already placed and entered into the system, the ERP system will net out inventory position and then identify, well, you're kind of getting close to zero. Do you want to order, right? Where ERP systems have traditionally struggled is on coming up with a prediction of demand that automatically accounts for natural patterns like trend. Demand is growing over time or declining over time, like seasonality. Certain periods of the year are busier than others, for example. And doing that at scale and in a way that is acceptable to the buyers, so that a buyer is looking at order suggestions and not scratching their head going, how did it come up with this? So I think historically, ERP has not done a good job of that. I think here at Epicor, we have, like, our distribution intensive applications have built in forecasting algorithms that will account for that. And, I came from a company that, we recently sold to Epicor. Epicor acquired us, and the focus of, smart software, and it's now an Epicor product, is really on analyzing demand and coming up with more accurate predictions of that demand and the associated stocking levels. So what I like to see when we talk about demand planning, it's not just about executing, because the order suggestions that are going to come out of an ERP, right, those are based on the planning parameters, the forecast, and then any buffering stocks like your reorder points or safety stocks to protect against the variability of demand, because no matter how good your forecast is, demand can exceed that forecast. At least half of the time it's going to do that. And then there's variability around lead times, right? So when businesses set these parameters, like something as simple and innocent as a min-max, right, or enter a forecast into an ERP, it has very significant consequences on the order schedule. And I think, like, at Epicor, we've done a pretty good job of making sure that the set of tools that are available to users for optimizing those inventory control parameters, something, again, as simple as a min-max, has significant consequences on an order schedule. Like, we can optimize those inputs using the analytics to make sure that the automated outputs, what to buy and when, are in fact the right numbers, so that buyers aren't scratching their head going, how did this order suggestion come up? And then having to interrogate the ERP. And I think that's something that we do really, really well.
The trade-off is working capital versus fill rate. I'm just broadly. Is it actually improving both of those, or at least maintaining fill rate and reducing working capital? What is the outcome of this better planning?
Right. So you can improve both at an aggregate level. Like if you have 1,000 items and you've got $10 million allocated across those 1,000 items, and you have an average on time and in fill service level fill rate of, let's say, 92%. If the inventory is misallocated, there are going to be many of those 1,000 items that just have way more than they need, and then many of those items that have a lot less than they need. And so your average fill rate may be 92%, and your on-hand stock as a consequence of the policies you've put forth yield about 10 million bucks in inventory. So absolutely, if you recalibrate the stocking parameters, those inventory control parameters, and the demand forecasts that are yield those ordering parameters, you can reduce the overall inventory while increasing the overall fill rates. And that's simply exploiting the fact that there's been a fair degree of misallocation, right? That occurs through, again, manual processes or processes that are exclusively intuition based and or reliant on very simple math like an average, right? And so when we talk about big data, right, and all of these powerful AI capabilities that are out there, let's kind of rein that in and look at, well, what can you do in just simply analyzing the demand patterns that you have and all of the uncertainty around that more effectively. That's not a big data analysis. That's just simple. And it's not simple. The math can be pretty robust, but it's it's a practical application of AI that's been doing this sort of thing for many, many years. So it's a proven capability, and you can get both of those results.
And so the AI is picking up seasonality, geographical things that would not otherwise be picked up in demand planning.
Yeah, so something as simple as seasonality, right? Where every December my demand increases, right? If I've got thousands of items, how do you figure that out? If you don't have a algorithm that's going to be able to look at the history and extrapolate that, you can't pick that up without defining rules. And we don't want users to have to define rules. The math should be able to pick that up. However, I think the number one benefit that AI can provide in the context of inventory planning is beyond simply picking up like a trend or a seasonal pattern, right? Because I think like that's fairly straightforward to do, right? When you have the right tools, of course. But it's more it's grappling with the fact that there's uncertainty, and no matter what I predict the demand to be, my actual can be above it or below it. No matter what I expect my lead time to be, so when I replenish, my actual lead times can be longer, right? At least some percentage of the time. So the real question that we want distributors to ask is, what is the stock out risk I'm willing to accept, right? Or the inverse of that is, what is the fill rate I need to maintain to maximize my effectiveness as a sales organization and a distributor? And what is it going to cost me, right? And so what is the right fill rate? Is it 90%? Is it 95%? Is it 99%? Because at 90%, you may have higher shortage costs because of the 10% of the time you're stocking out. That's very prohibitive for your business. And if you bumped it up to 92%, maybe those shortage costs drop just enough to make up for the added cost of buying inventory, right? Or maybe you need to bump it up to 95%. See, the problem is most distributors don't know those trade-offs. So they have literally no idea what the consequence is going to be if I add another week of supply to my reorder point. You know, they know that I'm doing that in reaction to maybe a stock out, but how high I need to go and what the consequences on both sides of the coin are going to be are really unknown. In other words, I bumped that up by 2 weeks. I take my reorder point from 8 weeks to 10 weeks. What am I going to have to spend in holding costs? And is that worth the added benefit of reducing my shortage costs? It may not be, right?
Yeah,
maybe we should
there's
bump
a
it up
point. There's
higher.
a point where it's going to flip, right?
Bingo, right. That inflection point, and businesses don't know that. And a practical application of AI is to identify that for every single item.
Amazing. Amazing. We may have a question from the audience here. How does Epicor specifically mitigate the risks of poor data quality that can affect the AI-powered forecasting?
Well, data quality is a team sport, right? We've got to give you the ability to enter the data in the proper tables in a structured way. And again, structured. It's not big data where data is just a mess, it's everywhere. It's structured, what you shipped to whom and when, what you sold to whom and when, right? And proper data governance, on behalf of users. So when you book a sales order transaction, right? What are the dates on that, right? If customers are placing orders early because they're trying to guarantee supply, is that date accurate, right? Because there are ways that we shape behaviors that end up corrupting the quality of the data, right? So the real way we can help you is to really assess how are you entering transactions, such as sales orders. What are the associated attributes for those transactions? And what does each attribute mean? If as a business, that, if you have dozens of different types of sales orders, right, and you can track all of that, then you can come up with a very accurate, what we call demand signal. And the demand signal is the best estimate of what your customers wanted from you and when. That's hard to come by, but it's a lot easier to derive that because of the structured data, that the structured environment that the ERP provides.
I think kind of a related idea to demand planning, which is looking at some of the similar data, is cross-selling. Justin, when you think about cross-selling, first of all, how would you define it? And second of all, what are the sources of data that you think are best used in cross-selling that is input to the machine learning, for example?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Cross-selling is hard, right? It is. Greg mentioned it. We've all seen it. There's a lot of different. Basically what we're doing is we're trying to give guidance to inside and outside salespeople on buyer intent, patterns, what they need when they need it, right? Cross-selling, you really have to look at the peers that are focused around this particular client. If I identify a client and say, okay, what can I upsell or cross-sell to them? It depends on the industry. Some are very project specific. So when they need what they need for that project, they move to another project. There's no cross-sell, upsell opportunity there necessarily because it's a completely different situation, right? Maybe it's the residential versus a commercial plumbing situation or electrical or whatever that is. So it's hard, and companies have to be really smart about it, because the worst thing you can do is make a recommendation to an inside or outside salesperson about a cross-sell, upsell situation that's not relevant at all to that customer. So we look at, from the data perspective, we look at a lot of different things. It's buyer signals, it's patterns. What did they buy? When did they buy it? As I mentioned, getting those peer groups together. Are we focused on a small wastewater treatment plant in a specific region that has, these weather patterns versus somebody else that may need something different to protect their pumps from freezing, or whatever those different situations are, SIC codes, like I said, or size of the organization, location, all these different things. So putting those peer groups together is critical. Size of the organization, all those different things. And then it's also looking at marketing and sales activities. So what pages did they visit on our website, for example? We can track a lot of different things to hone in on who that customer is, the account-based marketing, and figure out what should we make a recommendation to do. But it's, we can get a lot of interesting data, but it's also about finding the time for these inside outside salespeople to be able to follow up, right? And that's the other critical piece, freeing up some of their time so that they can follow up the right time, the right place with the right product.
So is part of the goal here to make your average rep more like your best rep in terms of cross-selling? Meaning the best reps might do this more intuitively than the not best reps.
Yeah, I mean, it is. So you've got, let's just take inside sales reps, for example. A lot of these roles have turned into order takers, right? So they've got a stack of quotes or orders that they're looking to manually enter into the ERP. Epicor is an example. And these keep stacking up. And, management's been pushing for sales or all sorts of things to get demand improved and sales to increase. And so, the best reps are those that are not just order takers, those that are looking for opportunities out there. But as we know, we've all stared at a CRM before or a customer database, and that's exhausting, right? There's way better tools and information. So what we do at Motivate is look at, those cross-sell, upsell, slippage alerts, buying patterns, trends, who visited the website when, for what particular product, and we give a specific task list based on priorities. And that task list refreshes often. So this customer has a pump, for example, that has a life cycle of 3 years. It's been 2.5 years. Who's on that, right? That pump could fail, and then that customer could, or that client could shop the vendor, right? So it's things like that. It's also, they just sent in a quote request, for example, and for a completely different product, but we notice based on these tasks, these alerts, that there's something set to be bought next week. Well, let's catch them when they're there and take the order when we can. So it's the guided selling mentality based on this big data that we're talking about, and AI and those recommendations on, let's make these reps as good as the best rep based on these recommendations and priorities and how they spend their time and how they spend their day.
You touched on something about the kind of business that you're selling to. So clearly the MRO style business, the kind of flow businesses are going to work well for cross-selling. How does it work in a quote situation where somebody's requesting a quote? How does it work in a situation that looks more like a bill of materials? Let's say electronics, assembly, they're requesting a bill of materials for production. How does the cross-selling work in either of those scenarios, if at all? I'm curious.
Yeah, it's really hard. I mean, you've got a building owner that's sending in a quote request for an electrical project. They're the pros; they know what they need. So, their goal is to get the information, the quote, as quickly as possible, and if they're ready to buy because they're shopping pricing or whatever they're doing at the time, to get that delivered quickly. Is it wise for a rep to try to upsell and cross-sell in that situation? It's really up to the business to decide that, but I've not seen that to be an advantageous situation often. Depending on the industry, again, it's like let's be careful about our upsell, cross-sell, and how pushy we are in these situations, because these businesses know what they want when they need it.
Yeah, it's similar. It's similar in like when the context and inventory planning, like this, the AI can optimize and say the ideal service level for this group of parts is 96% because that's the best balance of holding costs against the shortage costs. But if the VP of sales has a strong outsized influence in that business, says we can't run out any more than 1% of the time, then the idealized recommendation that the AI is providing is not going to be something that the business is going to adhere to. And that's perfectly okay, right? As long as everybody understands like what is the agreed upon set of rules that the business is leveraging to make those sorts of decisions on stock or cross-sell, determinations, right? Because your AI could recommend buy this or suggest that, but to that experienced customer who's got their bill of materials all laid out, they're like, just leave me alone. Like, just give me the quote, right? Same thing with the VP of sales. We'll be in a meeting and it's like, hey, look, your ideal service level is 96% because that's the best balance of holding costs. And he's like, no, we need 99. Okay, fine. Then use the AI to tell you what the minimum stock is to hit 99, right? Like, and then accept the excess risk that is now being incurred as a consequence of that business choice to override the AI. And again, that gets back to the concept too you mentioned of peer groups, right? I think that's a really good point, Justin, because when you're making these kinds of decisions on, how to proactively optimize your stocking policies and what service levels, you need to get buy-in from the different stakeholders, right? To set expectations on how often you're going to stock out for certain items. And the AI can help you do that and become a better individual decision maker that can arbitrate more effectively with the rest of the organization to set expectations.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So, I mean, back to the concept of sort of upsell or cross sell, I think that has to be taken into the context of everything else and the tasks and the functions that an inside salesperson is doing. You have to include slippage alerts, the rebuy times, all those different capacities. Now, the cross sell is interesting when it comes from an e-commerce perspective, right? Because I know that's a piece from the data side that businesses are really moving towards, because it's obviously the lowest cost to serve a customer. So if they're there and there's a big group and growing every day that wants to self-serve on e-commerce. So you can look at the cross-sell, upsell situation where, you're going through, you've got your parts lists, and, Motivate, for example, allows you to drag and drop an unstructured PDF of the purchase order, right? It goes through, it scans, it does its thing. And let's just say that that a product is out of stock, or you don't carry that particular supplier. That's where the upsell, sort of cross-sell replacement products comes in. And, Amazon's been doing this for years and years and years. Other customers bought products like this. So in an e-commerce environment, that's a pretty interesting scenario. Replacement products if you don't carry it, or you bought this, we recommend you buy this. It's a very non-pushy scenario when it just shows up, and it has, we've seen it, amounted to larger order volume because of those situations.
It'd be interesting, and this would be an exercise, but it'd be interesting if there's cross-sell recommendations that are probable as a consequence of how you've configured your tools. How might that impact the demand, which has not yet exhibited itself in the history of a given product, right? So if we could tie that together, again, it'd be an interesting project, but you could actually see, based on the cross-sell logic, how that might drive demand for other products, which could change the forecast for those items.
It's a huge signal as input to what you're talking about.
Absolutely.
Definitely had that thought. Justin, when the cross-sell works well, how do you measure that? What does that look like? Is it just bigger orders? Is it more revenue? How do you measure it?
Well, we look at it and break it down in individual tasks, right? And we're using the word cross-sell as kind of an overarching notification, but there's upsell as well, all sorts of different things. But it's like, when that recommendation is made to an inside salesperson, they accept that task and it amounts to an order. That's a pretty simple correlation between successful or not. I think the key with all these systems, conversion rate is really it.
Okay, that's it.
But we also look at it, if you envision tasks, there's an accept and decline by the inside salesperson when they use Motivate, right? If they're consistently rejecting a recommended task, the great thing about AI and machine learning is that we learn that pattern. So we see, regardless of the salesperson that's initiating that, and it might be they know that there's a lower commission on this particular product that's recommended and it's not worth their time, right? We can learn all those capacities, but what we want to do is serve up the upsell, cross-sell recommendation that's going to amount to the highest dollar profit margin, whatever it is, to that salesperson. And that's really where it comes to a priority. Because if you've got, let's just say you've got 10,000 customers and there's 500, the AI and the analytics recommend 500 cross-sell opportunities for one rep in a period of a week. Well, no one's going to be able to follow up with that many, right? And we know the success rate of email outreach and other things. It's about getting on the phone and calling a customer at the right place at the right time and making those recommendations. But we're not going to recommend 500 of them. So which one matters the most? It's, again, you look at profitability, You look at the success rate of previous recommendations to upsell to that particular client. So those are the analytics and sort of, behavior of trust and yeah.
The other one would be the utilization. How many of the recommendations are the reps even trying?
That's
Right.
right. Are they
Yeah.
accepting or rejecting? Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's before it even reaches the customer. So we correlate both of those. Did it sell? What's the conversion plus the acceptance rate? And we can start to get better and better as we go.
Fantastic. For our audience, cross sell has been the holy grail, and you can definitely make great inroads with AI based cross sell. It's it's a material impact. I want to shift back on the inventory side. So, Greg, can you give us a little more insight about the methodologies you use in inventory planning to align inventory needs with projected demand?
Sure. So the biggest thing that I always want to communicate is that we're dealing with uncertainty. We're dealing with the future. We don't know what will happen, right? So the one way we try to contend with that is coming up with a forecast. And you can come up with a forecast in a lot of different ways, right? The way we do it at Epicor is we have what we call an expert system that will select from many different choices of extrapolative methods that are designed to capture trend, seasonality, or if the data doesn't have any of those observable patterns, average through it, right? And so in an automated way, figuring out which method is most appropriate for the data, that can be done. And that yields a prediction of demand over time. Now, the way that it's done is it does a back test, or what we call a holdout analysis. So if you had 24 months of data for a given item, many different choices of the method of various statistical models would be run against the, let's say, 23 months of the data. And it would use those 23 months to predict month 24. And then the method that comes closest to predicting month 24, that's the method that we therefore then assume will be used to forecast the future. So we then take that winning method, give it all 24 months of the data, and then say predict into the future.
You mean you're running extreme gradient boosting against random forest, against deep learning neural nets, and see which one works the best for that thing? Or is it that kind of
not those exact explicit methods, but yes. So just think of it as there are many different methods. We call them time series based methods that analyze demand over time. Those time series methods extrapolate or not if there's nothing to extrapolate. And we do a holdout test to see which time series method from many dozens of choices yields the best answer over that holdout period. The one that does the best on an item by item or row by row basis is the one that then predicts the future using all of the available history. And that's what gets you the forecast. Now, the forecast by itself, though, is really the start of the process. Because the forecast, no matter how effective it is really just the midpoint between many possible answers, right? So if you think about like when you're watching the weather and they're showing the storm path, and they say the storm is going to have landfall like in Miami, right? Well, there's a range of where that storm could land. Miami is the midpoint of that range, but it could be north, it could be south. And frankly, it will be north or it will be south. By how much is really the question. And so the second layer of the AI, okay, after picking the right forecasting method, is to run probabilistic simulations of what could happen. And so we've built patented technologies at Epicor that will simulate the probability for each possible outcome that might occur, right? And that's what we can then use as a rich source of data from which to stress test how our choices of inventory policy will hold up against all of those potential outcomes. So if I've put together a set of reorder points, and a reorder point is the level of on-hand stock that when on hand gets to that level, you're going to place an order to replenish more, right? So that's going to be a huge driver on how much inventory you spend, what service levels you yield. Businesses by hook or crook, they've come up with these reorder points. The questions are, which ones of the which of those thousands of reorder points are likely going to be problems for you, right? I might have 100 units on hand and a reorder point of 80. So I don't have to order that product yet because my on hand's bigger than my reorder point. But do I know that 80 is ideal? Should that reorder point be 90 or should it be lower at 60, right? And so if I don't assess that proactively, I basically just have a whole bunch of, ordering policies that are just lying in wait to be a problem for me a week from now, 2 weeks from now, a month from now, 2 months from now, right? And so the whole point of the second part of this equation that the AI delivers, this probabilistic simulation, is to provide a rich source of outcomes that can then be used to stress test the policies. So if I have a reorder point of 100, I can simulate what the demand could be, what the lead times could be, and then I can literally benchmark how that reorder point held up. I can say, hey, look, and the AI will do this. It will run 10,000 simulated futures. And it will say, out of those 10,000 simulated futures, 1,000 of them resulted in a stock out. And the average magnitude of the stock out was $3,000, right? So now we know the cost of that stock out. We know the probability of that stock out. And now the business has to answer a question, which is that okay? And if that's not okay, let's do what if scenarios. So what might be okay? Maybe we want to only stock out 1% of the time. So now my reorder point might need to double. And what are the consequences of that doubling? My holding costs may far outweigh, the added holding costs may now far outweigh the benefit of reducing my stockouts. And that's the information we deliver. So that the math is really designed to give the best possible forecast. But that forecast, again, we have to understand what it's telling us, which is the midpoint of many possible values, right? The second step is to simulate all of the possibilities. And the third step is to use those simulated possibilities to stress test our existing choices, identify where those choices are weak, how they're weak, and then 4, change our policies to get acceptable predicted outputs and then redeploy them to the ERP so that they drive the daily ordering.
So that is incredible. I taught analytics at business school, University of Colorado, for 7 years. And one of the ideas that I would share with them is what I called not the law of averages, but the flaw of averages.
Absolutely. Right.
And, I think a lot of people get what an average is about, but it is often very misleading. And what you've done has gone way beyond that kind of approach. One of the things that's happening for distributors is we're going to be in a situation likely over the next 5 years where we need to do more with the same level of resource or potentially even more with less resource. One of the areas that is a huge opportunity for that is what customer service reps or inside sales reps, depends what you call them, how they handle orders and how they handle quotes. Justin, could you start by talking to us about what is available in the technology for order and quote automation?
Yeah, I'm happy to. It's, as you said, Jonathan, it's a hot topic, right? There are some traditional tools over the last 20, 30 years that have done a pretty good job of order automation. It's a big task for an inside sales team, especially those high volume industries, electrical, plumbing, HVAC, right? In order to grow, we have to field these orders. These orders have come in through email most of the time. Some visit the branches, but it's traditionally been a very labor intensive process. Somebody gets the order, it's on a purchase order that's handwritten, it's in an Excel file, it's whatever, all different formats, and they have to transfer that into the ERP. because of AI, because of some technology and those that know how to use it and how to use it well, there's been a big influx of need in recognition. Tools are available to automate this process, and it saves a tremendous amount of time. I mean, at Motivate, we're seeing 45% of the inside salesperson's task of entering order data, and that role is about a 60 to 70% of the day for that CSR actually entering orders for higher demand companies or quotes. So it's a big challenge. It's a huge opportunity to improve efficiencies, to save costs, a number of different things, and that essentially just involves meeting the customer where they're at. Don't make the customer change their process. They'll still be sending orders in via text, via email, handwritten notes, but the opportunity is getting it into the sales order process in the ERP as quickly and as most efficiently and accurate as possible, right? So that's the exercise here.
So let's separate the order from the quote. So if we just think about the order side of things, an order comes in, PDF, attached to an email, handwritten, whatever the format is. What are the sort of reasonable upper bounds on the level of automation you can get where it's lights out, where it's not touched by a human, and how long does it take to get there?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I've had a lot of these conversations about not touched by human. I mean, it's still, I haven't seen it yet where it's completely automated. I think the biggest part is we've got these CSRs that are, great with people and great with our products. Let's eliminate this manual entry, right? That comes through, saves a lot of time. Eyes still on it to make sure that, there's a good match. The tricky part is, well, the opportunity is that we know what customers have bought based on the ERP in the past, right? And we also have learned over time, maybe those patterns have changed, but it's that match rate with the general description of a product, not a SKU, not a part number, an ID, but an actual, like, I need, this valve or whatever it is, right? And getting a strong match there based on the data we've got from previous orders from the customers. So that matching is critical. If we automate and get the match wrong, that's a pretty embarrassing situation for a distributor if you're shipping the wrong product and you're trying to automate something so much to remove a person from it. So, the recommendation and basically where it's at right now, or people still are involved in that transaction, that process. And, sure, there's a cost cutting situation here that a lot of companies are deploying, but we look at that role from the CSR perspective. This is a little outside of the analytics conversation, but as an opportunity to do more, right? To participate in these sales insights that we had talked about at the first, the top of the hour. What are those recommendations? How can you spend more time with your customer instead of looking at this stack of both quotes and orders that have piled up that, sure, that's tough work, manual entry. So let's automate that process and give them, those CSRs, more time to spend with customers, to upsell, to cross sell, and provide good product information.
In case of an unambiguous order, sort of objectively unambiguous order, what percentage of automation can we get? I mean, are we looking at 80%? We're looking at 90, 95 over time? I'm not talking
so
about
in the case of not an exact match, right?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, in the case of like a general description on a product that wants to be ordered instead of a specific SKU or part ID, is that the question?
I'm thinking the other end of the spectrum, the unambiguous thing. Somebody says,
okay. Got
right.
It. Yeah, I mean, it's 99%.
Okay.
It's really, really good, especially when you reference previous purchasing history and generally where they're at, even if they change it up. It's really good.
So then the ambiguous one is somebody says, give me a big can of PVC glue. Well, there's not a SKU number in there. There's not a reference to Henkel. There's not a reference to 3M, right?
That's it. And then it's sort of what color, what size, all those different capacities, and really that's where the guided selling experience happens. So enough. It's not about picking 100 items, it's picking 3. So that CSR can go in and say, oh yeah, well, it's not an exact match, but I know, boom, here we go. Right. And then you've learned what that is for the next time that customer orders. So it's pretty remarkable when it comes to that automation perspective.
Now, on the order automation side, what you're able to do is essentially leapfrog of existing technologies. There have been technologies that have tried to do this. They do it for a smaller set of orders. They have to be less ambiguous, et cetera, et cetera. On the quote automation, this stuff's brand spanking new. Take us through what goes on in the quote automation, what some of the metrics are, what you're able to achieve with that.
We see it as the same. I mean, it's a customer needs either a quote or an order, right? They need it quickly, they need it accurate, and they just need it. So let's get it in and let's get it out as quickly as possible. Whatever the comfort level of that distributor is for, the amount of human that needs to be a part of it versus the automation, we can accommodate that. But ultimately, you're creating more value for the customer because they're getting that information much quicker, regardless if it's a quote or an order.
Interesting. Okay. I think the application of it is new, even if it is the same problem.
That's correct. That has not been available. But it's the same thing with, accounts payable, right? Invoices. It's whatever work.
It's a reconciliation problem. It's a reconciliation problem. Yeah,
yep,
imagine reconciliation. Okay. Yeah.
Right. And customers don't have to mold into a specific template to use it. I mean, no one wants to do that, right? This is how I do business. This is how I want to communicate with my suppliers. Here's my file. Get it to me as quickly and as accurate as possible without using a template to follow through. That's really what it comes down to.
Is there a different success measurement on the quote side than there is for the order side?
I mean, the success measurement that a lot of these companies are looking at is time to respond to customers, right? And they're measuring the error rate. So did we send the wrong thing? Did we quote the wrong thing, right? And so those are the success measurements when it comes down to it. Asking customers, it's a customer sat score at that point. Are we fulfilling your need as quickly as it possibly can? Yeah, your quotes are, much faster than supplier A, that we have to wait 24 hours because maybe they're backlogged. Okay, well, customers don't care. They want their information as quickly as possible. And availability is a key thing. Like all that data that Greg had talked about before about demand. I mean, that's all in the ERP that can be pulled out and communicated with automation.
I think that the win rate on quotes would be another metric. In other words, you go from a 24-hour quote turnaround to a 15-minute turnaround. Your win rate, it doesn't have to go up much to be huge value, and maybe even to be comparable in value to the productivity benefit for the CSRs.
Yeah, that's well said.
Right.
Very good. Yep.
So, and there are some sectors or some businesses where quote turnaround time really, really matters. It doesn't matter as much in construction; those are longer lead times. But in the MRO industrial world, there are parts of that world where fast quote turnaround is, first quote wins kind of a thing. So.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Same deal on, your service levels for the different sorts of parts. I mean, if it's a part that we can source from multiple suppliers, and we can expedite when when we need to, our target service level doesn't need to be as high. We can risk a higher probability of not filling an order right away. But if it's an MRO, if it's a spare part that's keeping equipment running, you better have it right away. You may even pay penalties. And so that gets to the heart of like, what service level do you target and how do you allocate it across, the different portfolios of items that you maintain that each have their own unique stock out pain.
Yep. Makes total sense. Hey, we've got a quick question here from the audience. Briefly, short of AI, what are the best software tools to analyze data? So Greg, you're saying it's not just Excel. What are the best software tools that come to mind for you?
Well, I mean, it's a very broad question, right? I mean, but I would simply say, like, for pure analysis purposes, any kind of BI tool, right? Because that's going to give you insights into, into what's, where where business is coming from, who's buying it. You can drill in, you can pivot. At Epicor, we've made big investments in BI with Grow. I think when we get into what the analysis should be, it's about, again, having a structured set of data, creating data lakes, pulling data from a variety of business systems. You may have ERP, you may have a lot of different add-ons, and all of that data is in its own silos. Putting it up into a common structured data repository that you can then run BI against, I think, is an important component of that. So BI tools, and I would say forecasting tools as well. I mean, it gets to the heart of the largest asset on a distributor's balance sheet, inventory. So focus on that.
Justin.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty there's all sorts of different analytics tools that people use. There's Power BI, the very expensive tools. There's tools like Domo. I mean, you can throw a pile of data in a lot of these tools, and they're really smart and really good about cutting things up. I definitely think that's a mature market that wouldn't take much to pull together, especially if it doesn't need to be real time synced. It's just give me a historical set of data and drop it in, and then tell me what I need. I think the next interesting part is then taking that data that's sliced and diced and applying AI to it, right? And prompting it to specific questions. Okay, tell me what I need to do about this. It's incredible what just your standard Chat GPT free tool does with unstructured sets of data. I'm talking about millions of rows, but thousands, right? If you apply the AI or the API to it as well, you can get some pretty interesting conclusions based on the export of some of that. And I know some of the analytics tools are now applying those same, thought leadership and AI to their modules so that you can start to get answers and critical paths on what that is.
One recommendation I'd have is look for purpose-built capabilities, right? Because a BI is great, but it's a very, horizontal set of applications. If you want to solve a very specific business problem, right, like cross-sell, upsell, you need a purpose-built tool for that. Like optimizing stocking policies, in my opinion, you need a purpose-built tool for that. And there are plenty of purpose-built tools for specific sets of functions that act as natural extensions to the ERP. And so that's what we've done, at Epicor. There's a lot of extension-based products we've acquired from different acquisitions or developed that I think really complement the core of what we do, quite nicely. But get purpose-built.
Greg and Justin, thank you for a very, very rich discussion today. Particularly appreciate those last pieces there. I want to give our audience an idea about what's coming up next week. We're going to be talking on wholesale change featuring RJ Silly, and he's CEO of Vumi Supply. It's a bit of a marketplace that'll be sponsored by Epicor, Net at Work, and Band. So I want to thank you guys again, and wishing everybody a good rest of the day, and stay warm.
Thank you, Jonathan.